Welcome to our Simondon reading group. We're continuing with Individuation, Volume 2, History of the Notion of the Individual. We've been doing for a couple months now, and have probably another few months still, because this is like a short book almost within the book. So we're on the early Christian era. I should get the PDF open. That would help. So we're on the early Christian era. We looked at some of the early Christian heresies. So they generally have to do with either the doctrine of the Trinity or the doctrine of the nature of Christ. And so the Orthodox doctrines of both the Trinity and the nature of Christ involve this, at least apparently contradictory conception, where so like in the nature of the Trinity, there's this idea of the three in one. So God is three persons in one substance, and then in the concept of Christ, Christ is both fully human and fully divine. And so these at least apparently contradictory concepts led to a lot of different sort of splits within early Christianity over those different sides of the contradiction, where different schools would sort of pick one side and hold on to that. So they would say that either Christ was just a human being who had a sort of divine blessing or divine mission or something like that. Or on the other hand, they would say that Christ was fully divine and only sort of took on a human appearance and was never fully human. So they sort of pick one side of the contradiction and hold on to that side and deny the other side. So those are some of the heresies that appeared in early Christianity that we looked at last time. And then we were just talking about this before we started recording, but we also saw these two important concepts that Simondon develops or points to in Christianity, that he argues that these concepts sort of reappear throughout the history of Christianity, and there's a sort of tension between two ideas that he calls procession and conversion. Let me just find the page reference again. But there are sort of so there are these two opposed ideas about the relationship between the Christian believer and God and the Christian community. So there's this idea of so in the processive conception of Christianity, the individual believer has an individual relationship with God, and so it has to do with faith and this sort of individual relationship, whereas in the I think I'm mixing those two up. In the processive conception, it's through the community that the believer has a relationship to God. So the church is an institution that bears the tradition of the apostles and sort of continues through history. And it's a sort of continuous chain of connection from the apostles to the individual believer. And so the believer has to be incorporated into the Christian community through the rite of baptism, and has to be part of that community in order to have a relationship to God. And then the other conception, or the other sort of strain within Christianity, is the conversion strain, which is the individual one. Sorry, I mixed those two up earlier. But the conversion side, so it has to do with the individual converting to Christianity, or converting to faith in God, and having this individual relationship with God, and it sort of goes around the community, or it's not mediated by the community, and so these two conceptions coexist within Christianity, and like different schools or traditions within Christianity sort of lean towards one side or the other. So obviously the Protestant Reformation is in general leaning more towards the individual side, the conversion side, whereas the Catholic Church leans more towards the procession side. But each of these strains coexist within every Christian denomination.
It seems like he associates different kind of modes of participation with procession and conversion. And in this section on St. Anselm, he says that procession entails this kind of descending continuity in the conception of, I guess, the cosmos and the relation of the individual to the cosmos. That I think involves, like, at least in this, I can't remember which example he was giving here, but in this example he's giving in the St. Anselm section, he says that the continuity, there's a degradation that happens from the good or God or whatever the highest term is, all the way down to matter. And it seems like I was trying to understand how that the continuity means that you have to have the community for the baptism to sort of save the isolated individual, and why an individual would be isolated if there was a continuity. But I think it might be the irreversibility of the descent, the descent, or the. I think he also referred to the movements from the One and Plotinus as a procession. So there's this kind of irreversible movement away from the good towards matter, and then in order to save the individual, you have to have the community to sort of to reverse that. And then my understanding of the mode of participation in conversion is that it seems to be by way of like structural analogy between like the human and the cosmos, or the human and the divine, or what is knowable and the divine, or something like that. And so that's why it's immediate and doesn't need the community. But yeah, I'm still trying to work that out.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you're right to point back to the Neoplatonism section, because this notion of a procession is one of the key concepts of Neoplatonism. So in Plotinus and other Neoplatonists, there's this concept of procession, which is sort of the counterpart of Plato's idea of ideas, of participating in ideas. So there's instead of having entities sort of point upwards towards the ideas, there's instead this downward pointing from the ideas to entities, and the ideas themselves proceed from the good, which is above the realm of essences or of ideas, and so there's the good, or the one, that sort of overflows into these ideas at the level of the intellect, and then those ideas overflow into the entities that we see and feel and so on in the physical world, all the way down to matter. So there's this that's sort of the Neoplatonist conception, is this hierarchy of being from the good all the way down to matter. And the Christian conception takes over a lot of that idea from the Neoplatonists, but one sort of key difference is the idea of creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, creation ex nihilo. And this is one of the key doctrines of I think Augustine argues against some of the other schools or other religious traditions of the time. That so instead of having something like we see in Plato's Timaeus, we have the demiurge creates the world, but does so by taking matter that already exists and imposing a certain structure on it, and sort of putting things together into the world. So this is a sort of a typical kind of pagan conception of the creation of the world out of some pre-existing matter or pre-existing material of some kind, and putting it together into a world. And then in the Christian doctrine, God creates the world not by putting things together, but out of nothing. And so there's this dependence, ontological dependence of the world on God in a way that is not the case for the Platonic doctrine found in the Timaeus. And so what this has to do with procession is that because in the Neoplatonist doctrine, everything proceeds out of the one. There's a sort of continuity between the one and everything else. There's no sort of gap between the one and the entities that proceed out of the one. Whereas in the Christian doctrine, God and created entities are ontologically distinct. They're completely separate kinds of beings. So when we think about this procession, it's only because the church sort of bears the tradition. It has this continuous chain of connection back to the apostles who had this immediate relationship to Christ. It's only because of this chain that we can sort of bridge the gap, the ontological gap between the finite creatures that we are and God as the creator of everything. And so it's the church as an institution that sort of fills that gap or bears that chain of tradition that allows for that relationship. And then in conversion, in the conversion tradition, there's this idea that by this act of conversion or this act of faith, we find God not only as an external entity, as something sort of outside us that created the world and so on, but we find God within ourselves. We have like a sort of internal relationship to God, and that allows for this. This is sort of what allows the act of conversion to happen. So both traditions are specifically Christian, so they are opposed to the pagan conception of the creation of the world, but they sort of emphasize different sides of what this ontological dependence of the creature on God means. Okay, so I think we can get started with today's reading. I think we were at the Rossellinus section on page 528 of the PDF, if that's where everyone else has as well. Okay, yeah, so let's start there. Angus, do you want to start reading?
Yes. 1 second. Rossellinus. This double attitude toward individual reality, which I think is conversion and procession.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Here's in the debate over universals. For Rossellinus, who speaks against St. Anselm, the universe seems to be fragmented into individuals. The distinction between individual substances alone is real, while other distinctions are merely an, quote, exhalation of the voice, unquote. Under these conditions, the dialectic has nothing to do with things, only with words insofar as they signify things. Individuality is the principle of real distinction, and it is the only principle of real distinction. Here, nominalism is a consequence of the way individual realities are represented. According to the dialecticians who inspire Rossellinus, individuals are like absolutes. Across this tradition of dialecticians, passing through, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Boethius, and Simplicius of Cilicia, what is sought and rediscovered is the logic of Aristotle. All the distinctions brought to bear by the dialectic between genus and species, substance and quality are merely verbal distinctions based on human discourse. The nominalists, the individual is not only an absolute in its rapport to other realities, but also in its rapport to itself. Division of the body into corporeal parts seems to Rossellinus completely arbitrary and conventional. Every body, e.g. a house, is indivisible. To say that it is in reality composed of foundations, walls, and a roof is to consider one of its parts, the roof, for example, both as a part of a whole and as a distinct thing in an enumeration of three things. This amounts to saying that if a thing is sufficiently individualized to be a distinct part in a whole, then it possesses complete individuality. Consequently, the conception of divine individuality becomes difficult in Rossellinus's nominalism. In God, there are as many substances as distinct persons. Father and the Son, the begetter and the begat, are two individually and therefore substantially distinct realities. three persons are as separate as three angels would be, and if there is a unity between them, it is only a unity of will and of power. In this radicalism of the conception of the individual no longer acknowledges division superposed onto its substantiality. It cannot be one and multiple at the same time. At the basis of this attitude, we find this principle that relation does not have the value of being. Relation that exists between the three divine persons has no value of being and cannot guarantee the substantial unity of these three persons in a single God. This affirmation was considered heretical by the Council of Soissons in 1092, and Roscellinus was forced to retract. In conformity with this principle, Roscellinus did not want to distinguish the attributes of God, goodness, power, etc., from his substance, no more than he wanted to distinguish the divine person incarnated in Jesus from his humanity. According to the thought that seeks participation in conversion, the individual is not a radical. Not only is the individual not isolated from other realities, to the point that every distinction is the sign of a distinct substantial individuality, it also possesses real parts within it that exist according to a structure and are distinct from one another. In the Platonic vision, the individual was able to be considered as a microcosm. Relation still had the value of being in that case, and the relation between the microcosm and the macrocosm is partly founded on the fact that the individual possesses an internal structure analogous to that of the whole in which it participates. Analogy founds participation by establishing a continuity of rapport between the being that participates and the being in which it participates. Man, as God's image, participates in God through this very image. Here, the individual is not an isolated being, but is completely defined as a limited reality. In some sense, it may be said that the individual participates because it is a whole, because it possesses a structure. So it seems like, if I'm understanding what he's saying correctly here, it seems like conversion, at least seen in light of Roscellinus's philosophy, is this kind of Platonic analogical relation between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Or is he saying that Roscellinus is a thinker of procession and this Platonic vision is conversion in opposition to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think he's opposing what he calls here the Platonic vision, so this analogical relationship between God and the individual believer. I think he's opposing this Platonic vision to both conversion and procession as two alternate Christian traditions or two different conceptions of that relationship between God and the believer in Christianity. So I think he's contrasting Roscellinus's. So Roscellinus's conception has this sort of primacy of the individual. It takes the individual to be an absolute and completely isolated entity, and so that applies to the human individual as well. So the human individual is this unity, and the sort of, well, one of the difficulties of this conception is how we can understand the relationship between the individual believer and God on this conception. If the individual is something sort of autonomous and absolute and self-consistent and so on, then it becomes hard to understand what that relation to God would consist in. And so I think so in addition to the issues with the Trinity and so on that Simondon discusses a little bit earlier, I think this sort of autonomy of the individual is part of what makes Roscellinus's conception heretical. And so this is in contrast to the conversion. So when he says here, where is that? Yeah, so on page 529 of the PDF, about 3/4 of the way down the page, he says, according to the thought that seeks participation in conversion, the individual is not a radical unity. So this is in contrast to Roscellinus's thought. So for Roscellinus, the individual is a radical unity, and so the conception of conversion, in which the individual has this immediate relation to God or individual relation to God, the individual has to be something that is not self-contained, because the individual finds God within themselves, and so there's a sort of exteriority of the self to itself, or the self. The individual is not self-contained or self-consistent because it contains this relationship to God within itself. So here he's contrasting he's not just contrasting the conversion and procession perspectives, but he's contrasting both of those perspectives with Rossellinus's conception of the autonomous individual, and also with the Platonic conception of this analogical relationship between the human and the divine. So we have four different conceptions of that relationship that are all being contrasted with each other here.
A little bit of transitional note on Simondon's part would have been really helpful there, because it's not at all clear why he's suddenly but for Plato it was something else.
Yes. I mean, we should probably keep in mind as we read this text that it was never sort of prepared for publication. So I don't know exactly what sort of state the manuscript was in when the editors sort of took it up and included it in the text here. But so we find some of these kinds of transitions even in the published text, where he just sort of seems to pass from one topic to the other without any sort of obvious transition. But we should probably keep in mind that this text was not prepared for publication by Simondon. So it, potentially, if he were to, if he had prepared it himself for publication, he might have sort of smoothed over some of these transition points. Okay, so let's go on to, let's see, we have one short section, two short sections. So maybe if we can read the next two sections, if someone else would like to read, or if we have no volunteers, I can read. Okay. Christian thought in the 12th century. However, Christian thought in the 12th century reveals a need for unity in this doctrine. This is the time of the encyclopedias named specula, questions, or sentences, like those of Ivo of Chartres, Radulphus Ardents, Anselm of Laon, William of Champeaux, Robert Pullen, Robert of Melun, Peter Lombard, and ultimately Abelard Sticket et Non, whose method is also found in Pierre Lombard's Pro et Contra. Nevertheless, despite the unity of method that appears in the scholastics, the divergence between attitudes relative to the nature of individuality remains. Faithful to a Platonic inspiration, the school of Chartres and John Scotus Eriugena situate between the particular being and the world the continuity expressed in the eternal necessity of the movement of descent from and return toward God. Conversely, Lombard and Thomas Aquinas assert discontinuity and introduce a completely free and contingent initiative into each act of the drama. The school of Chartres. The thought of the school of Chartres is also found in ancient culture. Constantine the African translates certain medical books of the Jews and Arabs, the Aphorisms of Hippocrates with Galen's commentary, and two works of Galen himself. The corpuscular physics of Democritus is known because of these books. Adela of Bath journeys to Greece and various Arab nations. He translates mathematical works, in particular Euclid's Elements and the Arithmetic of Al-Khwarizmi, and he is also familiar with the Timaeus. For Abelard, alongside universals to which a reality proper cannot be granted, there are archetypes. These archetypes are neither genera nor species, which can only be conceived in their rapport to individuals. Archetypes exist and are conceived outside sensible things in the divine mind. The goal of dialectics is to contemplate these archetypes. In the treatise De Eodem et Diverso, on the same and the different, which is written to justify philosophy, the understanding is presented as knowing things and their causes. It is only due to the aftermath of forgetting, and because the soul is in the prison of the body, that this knowledge is partly lost. At that point, the soul calls upon opinion. The Aristotelian inductive method is only valid in accordance with this degradation. In fact, the individual soul, as Plato asserts in his theory of reminiscence, is pregnant with the knowledge of the archetypes. The knowledge we have of the archetypes is not a flatus vocis, an exhalation of the voice, but a real knowledge. There is a relation of analogy between the archetypes and the notion of these archetypes within us. The soul is sister of the ideas. The individual is therefore not isolated from the reality that he knows. Knowledge is a participation through conversion founded on the reality of the analogical relation. There is no discontinuity between the knowing subject and the object known. This relation, that is knowledge, is founded on being. It has the value of being. If knowledge plays a vast role in this theory in conformity with Platonic thought, This is because it is that through which the individual participates in divine reality, insofar as the good of Plato becomes the God of the Platonic Christians. Under these conditions, the individual cannot be a closed and limited reality. Science, savoir, is not only capable of fixing the knowledge, connaissance, defined by the past, it can also extend it. This is what Bernard of Chartres expresses by providing a remarkable image of continuity in the development of human knowledge. We are like dwarves on the shoulder of giants. For Bernard of Chartres, universals are identical to Platonic ideas. The notions of microcosm and macrocosm are presented in the work of Bernard Silvestris, entitled De Mundi Universitate Sive Megacosmos et Microcosmos, which conforms with the theory of the Timaeus. Lastly, in Bernard Silvestris's cosmogony, which to a certain extent is the first mystery, the continuity of the universe appears very clearly. The Trinity becomes hierarchical and forms the echelons of an order that goes uninterrupted all the way up to the universe as a whole. The Father is identical to the good, tagaton. The Son is nous. The Spirit is the world soul, or endelechia, continuity, that emanates from nous. Lastly, the world soul informs yet another hypostasis inferior to it, natura. We find species, genus, and individuals enclosed in the nous, intelligible world. Quote, the whole series of destinies, the arrangement of the centuries, the tears of the poor, and the fortunes of kings, unquote. In this vision, quote, everything that will engender matter, the elements, etc., unquote, is found to participate in the reality of the Father in advance without any arbitrary intervention in the order of time. It is thereby understood that the human being can be engendered not by a creative act of the Father, but by the simultaneous operation of nous and natura. Natura forms the body of man with the four elements. This same inspiration is also found in Alain de Lille, who renews the doctrine of microcosmic man formed by the same parts as nature. Nature herself is like a human being, like a young maiden wearing an ornate crown of stones, which symbolizes the planets, and a robe embroidered with the complete variety of beings. This doctrine of the real analogy between the individual and the universe was already found in Nemesius's treatise On the Nature of Man, which was translated by Alphanus I in 1058. But Alain de Lille adds specific specifications to this vision, and these specifications are reminiscent of the Timaeus. Reason in man is like the movement of the sphere of the fixed stars, and sensibility with its varieties is like the movement of the oblique spheres of the planets. The soul is even like a divine city, wherein reason in the head corresponds to God and to the heavens, ardor in the heart corresponds to the angels and the air, and the lower regions of the waste correspond to man and the earth. Such is the universal analogy between the microcosm and the macrocosm, between universal life and individual life, which the plaint of nature reveals as the foundation of the secret affinities due to which there is participation of the individual in the whole. The difference between God and nature is merely that of unity and multiplicity, which is itself just a developed unity. Nature says, quote, the operation of God is simple and mine is multiple. And versus Hyre says, this conception is inspired by Plato through Proclus's Platonic theology. Thus, reflection becomes a power of the individual being. Whereas previously the trivium and quadrivium were merely subservient to faith, the quadrivium is considered by William of Conches as the first part of philosophy, the second part of which is theology. The trivium, or eloquence, is more opposed to the scientific or philosophical study of nature than this very study is opposed to theology. Consequently, the formation of individual beings can be explained by an autonomous physics. Living individuals are beings composed of particles by the operation of natura operans. A vast naturalism establishes continuity between individual beings and the whole. The inspiration of Plato is combined with that of Lucretius and the Stoics to form the notion of a vigorem naturalem, inserted by God into things and through which certain beings live, others live and feel, and still others live, feel, and reason. Such are the, quote, forces of nature, which are a mediation between God and created individuals, thereby establishing continuity between the individual and God in whom it participates. Procession itself is conceived here in a form that legitimizes conversion beforehand. Such is the role of this notion of nature elaborated in the 12th century with so much firmness, thereby establishing a reversibility between the two forms of participation, which were in opposition until then. The mysticism of the Victorians does not disavow this tendency. For Bernard of Clairvaux, the human individual is not isolated from Christ. The Christian has the capacity to be saved by following Christ. A continuous path goes from consideration or research, which is meditation on oneself, on the world, and on God, to contemplation, which is a certain and indubitable conception of truth. And this path ultimately leads to ecstasy, wherein the soul is deified in the end. The tradition of universalism in knowledge is conserved by the Victorians. The knowledge of God is effectuated according to 5 increasingly perfect modes, in which the first 2 modes veritably manifest this continuity, between the individual and the reality in which it participates. The contemplation of nature leads to the idea of the creator. The contemplation of the nature of the soul, which is everywhere in the body just as God is everywhere in the universe, gives us an image of divine essence. Such is the doctrine of Hugh of St. Victor's on contemplation and its forms. Like St. Anselm, Richard of St. Victor wants to rediscover the necessary reasons for divine dogmas, and he titles his work The Grace of Contemplation. Sorry, that section was longer than I thought. Probably should have broken that up into two. So we sort of passed abruptly from early Christianity. So we were talking about we were in sort of the 4th and 5th century AD. And then we had one bit on Anselm, who I think is in the 10th century, 10th or 11th century, and then Roscellinus, and then now we pass to the 12th century. So we're sort of skipping through the medieval era relatively quickly. Again, this is stuff that I don't really know very well, only secondhand. So I can't really comment a lot about this, but I know that there were, like in the 12th century, there's sometimes what's called the 12th century Renaissance. There was a certain rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been kind of lost to the Western world, at least for several centuries. And so we see here that there are, like at the beginning of this text, of this passage, we have reference to some of the ancient Greek works that were sort of rediscovered at this time, and the kind of naturalism that appears, or sort of a relative naturalism, but taking up some of the ideas of the Stoics and the Epicureans, and sort of developing a kind of naturalism in a Christian context. So it's still a Christian philosophy, but it's one in which there's a valorization of nature and a kind of autonomy of nature, so we can understand nature in its own terms and not only as a creation of God. And we also find here, I think maybe a complication of what I was suggesting earlier about the 4 different ideas of the relation between the human and the divine, because here this sort of reactivation of Platonic thought that happens in this 12th century Renaissance, it serves to kind of, as Simondon puts it here, it institutes a reversibility between these 2 forms, the procession and the conversion form of Christianity. So when you sort of intertwine these 3 different ideas of the relation between God and the human being, you end up with a kind of, this notion of an analogy between the human individual as the microcosm and the universe or God as the macrocosm. It means that there's a kind of continuity between God and the natural world. And then the human as a part of that natural world. So it means that this the role of the community in sort of bridging the ontological gap between God and the world is no longer the same. We don't have the same ontological gap. We have this continuity instead, and the individual relationship to God and the communal relationship to God are sort of interchangeable, or are sort of like alternatives, perspectives that are both equivalent under this conception, as opposed to being sort of 2 opposed perspectives as they are or as they were previously. So we have this complicated sort of intertwining of the Platonic analogical perspective and then the conversion and procession perspectives. So they all sort of are joined together in this 12th century Renaissance.
I thought that this, when he says that procession itself is conceived here in a form that legitimizes conversion beforehand, I sort of linked this back to the the point that he made about continuity and procession in that earlier section, and I thought that this here it was referring to the different capacities like reason, sensation. Oh yeah, the vigorum naturalum, through which certain beings live, others live and feel, and so others live, feel, and reason. So that would be the kind of the procession or gradual degradation that happens from, I guess, the ability to reason to the ability to feel or merely live, and that continuity is what allows for this direct, because it involves the faculty of reason. It allows for this kind of direct relationship to God or the cosmos. Do you think that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this role of the vigorem naturalem or the forces of nature is sort of instituting this continuity, and so there's a continuity between entities that have reason, so human beings and I guess angels as well. There's a continuity from these entities to the entities that only have life and sensation, so that would be other animals, and then downward to entities that only have life, the plants, and I guess down to entities that don't have any of these capacities, like minerals and so on. So there's a continuity in this ontological scale, and as a result, it means that this ontological continuity in the scale of nature or in the scale of being means that there's no ontological gap for procession, for the relationship to the community to have to bridge. So whereas in the previous conceptions, we needed this tradition from the apostles down to the present in order to have a relationship to God through procession. In this conception, procession from God and the sort of individual relationship to God are sort of equivalent to each other because there's no ontological gap anymore.
And then the idea of Adelard's archetypes, I thought that was like, I don't know, it seems like he's rediscovering universals and just calling them something else and saying, yeah, universals themselves are purely nominal, but then there are archetypes, which basically do the same thing, but they're real. I didn't really understand what distinction he was actually drawing there. I'm sure it's more subtle than that.
Yeah, I also, again, I don't know this firsthand, so I'm not sure exactly what the distinction is between archetypes and universals. I guess so. As far as I can tell from this text, the archetypes are not meant to be a species. So, like, there's no archetypes are individuals, not species. So they don't sort of contain multiple entities. So species, understood as a collection or a set of entities, are purely nominal. They only exist insofar as we assign a name to them. Whereas the archetypes are individual ideas in the mind of God, and sort of patterns from which individual entities are created. And so I think it's this distinction between a species as a collection of entities and then the archetype as an individual entity. I think it's probably this that he has in mind, and that's probably what the distinction is here, but I'm not super confident in that interpretation.
That's really interesting if there's this idea of literally individual ideas in the mind of God. That would seem to be, seems to be very different than from Platonism and Aristotelianism, where the form is the species or the kind, or and then the individual is sort of accidental.
Yeah, I think, well, for Plato, it's always a little bit difficult to say what exactly his doctrine is because, of course, the dialogue form. But for Plato, I think the ideas have this sort of hybrid status or sort of ambiguous status. So there's an idea of man or an idea of the horse or whatever, and individual horses participate in this idea of the horse, but the idea of the horse is not itself identical to the collection of horses. So it's not something plural or collective. It's there's a singular form of the horse, and all horses participate in the horse, and have their sort of individual particularities, their particular qualities, being this tall and this color and so on. But the ideas themselves are not collections, but they have this sort of inherent capacity to be instantiated in more than one individual. So even though the horse, the idea of the horse is not a collection, but at the same time, it's something that can be instantiated in multiple different individuals. So it's not plural, but it also has the capacity for plurality in that sense. So there's a sort of ambiguous status of the ideas in Plato, and I guess here what we see is a sort of split of those two sides of the idea, where on the one hand the plurality is sort of split off and treated as merely nominal, and then the singularity is treated as a real entity, the archetype, which is distinct from the merely nominal universal. That seems to be what's going on here.
I see. Yeah, that's very interesting.
But again, this is something that you would have to go back to these texts themselves and see if that interpretation is correct, to have any confidence in that interpretation, because I'm getting all this secondhand through Simondon, who I think is also getting it secondhand through Breillet or someone else. So yeah, we're sort of at third-hand interpretation doing this. Okay, so let's go on to the section on Abelard. Yeah, that's a short section. Yeah, let's do the next two sections. If someone else would like to read.
Okay, yeah, I can read. Abelard. This force of individual thought is expressed to the highest extent in Peter Abelard's genius. He has been criticized for wanting to establish a dogma wherein all mystery is suppressed, which negates the need for tradition, and from which a morality would ensue that would rely on man's confidence in himself and nullify the need for grace with the sacrament. According to Bernard of Clairvaux, Abelard exhibited immense pride, which led to making human genius, humanum ingenium, usurp everything for itself, thereby leaving nothing to faith. And de facto, Abelard indeed offers the appearance of what could be called an extreme individualism, with the Historia Calamitatum at the end of his life. The knowledge of God surpasses the dialectic and the whole content of the Trivium. Quote, in himself, God violates the rules of the philosophers, unquote. Nevertheless, there remains the path of similitudes practiced by Plato and St. Augustine. Philosophical notions provide an image of divine reality. Correlatively, the morality that scitote ipsum, know thyself, proposes is individualistic. Monastic life, the sacraments, and the merits of faith are useless. Marriage between monks and nuns is not forbidden. No trace of respect for the community's authority remains. Sin is purely personal, and there is no possibility for any reversibility of mistakes. No man can know the intentions of another, since the mistake is in the intention alone. Since the mistake is in the intention alone, one cannot judge others. The very merits of Christ are not reversible for us. Salvation is purely personal. Penances cannot be remitted by priests, no more than sins can be forgiven by bishops. Abelard therefore goes to the point of refusing all participation in order to safeguard the individual's force and freedom. The Albigenses. The end of the 12th century is marked by a number of aspirations to evangelical purity, either in the sense of historical continuity effectuating the advent of pure spirituality, as in Joachim of Fiore, who proclaims the coming at hand of the kingdom of the Spirit, or by a direct aspiration of purity of the Albigenses, who want to deliver themselves from sins in order to become cathars, pure ones. What is quite remarkable in this aspiration in conformity with the Gnostics' doctrine is that in order to rediscover his veritable nature, which is that of the soul before it is enclosed in the body, the human individual must carry out within himself a division between what is of celestial origin, and therefore angelic in nature, and what is of terrestrial origin, i.e. the body, the vital principle, and the desires or tendencies that arise from the latter. The human being is vaster than the veritable. The veritable individual is rediscovered and isolated from what is not itself by way of a separation, reduction. Purity is an isolation of the individual. The individual is simpler than the being, who is already a composite. Isolated from the community of the church and from everything that is the temporal world, abstaining from all participation of the church taken as the dispensator of sacraments, the human being is not yet a veritable individual. He remains impure because he is devil. He must yet purify himself. And for the Cathars, to purify oneself is to simplify oneself. The conception of individuality at the basis of the doctrine of the Albigenses is an affirmation of substantial simplicity as constitutive of individual nature. The individual's participation in the divine therefore occurs by way of substantial identity. Pure spirituality in man rejoins spirituality in God without passing through any mediation. The thought of the Albigenses is a doctrine of pure conversion. But we should note in particular that this doctrine can only be applicable if veritable individuality is considered to be more limited than the apparent content of human individuality. Pure conversion in some sense requires a preliminary simplification of the individual in the Albigensian sense as a simpler being. Everything happens as if in this conflict between the orthodox doctrines and the doctrine of the Albigenses, two paths appear for discovering the individual's participation in the divine that are mutually exclusive, while at the same time somewhat equivalent. The Albigenses want to avoid subordinating the individual to the mediation of the community with its sacraments and its authority. But then in individual isolation, there appears another subjection internal to the individual, and another mediation consisting in necessity to pass through the operation of the body in order to act and feel. It's as if this internal mediation were merely another aspect of the mediation that appears externally as a communitarian mediation. Rejection of external mediation reinforces the individual being is not just in himself. The necessity of participation forces him to modify his initial limits, either toward the outside or toward the inside. These are therefore perhaps two equivalent or merely complementary operations. It could be that each form of participation, processive form of conversion, are addressed to different realities within the individual being, and that the option in favor of this or that form of participation can only be elaborated after a simplification of the individual. After a simplification of the individual being. To conserve the whole being, it would be necessary to discover a mode of compatibility between the two types of participation. We find a type of participation that inverts the Albigensian amoric, at least in a certain sense. Indeed, he attempts to discover the source of participation in a pantheistic unity. For him, each man is a member of Christ, the only reality that exists, eternally identical to itself as God. Salvation consists only in the science or knowledge that God is in all things. This profound monism leads to the same practical attitude as that of the Cathars. Spirit must replace the church, derived from the Stoics and John Scotus of Aegina. This line of thought elaborates a direct conversion without splitting the human being. But here conversion is founded on a procession that exists before the human being. It is because of the simultaneity of procession and conversion. Splitting is no longer necessary in this ethics. The same search for unity between procession and conversion is encountered in David of Dinant's work, De Thomis Seu Divisionibus. This writing was condemned in 1210 at the Synod of Paris, along with Eriugeni's De Divisione Naturae. According to De Thomis Seu Divisionibus, the individuality of each being is founded on the existence of an indivisible principle, matter for bodies, intelligence or spirit for souls, God for separate substances. But this triad merely designates a single substance. For if distinct terms are discerned therein, one must acknowledge above them a simple and indivisible principle. It contains in it what they share in common. This reasoning conforms with the thought contained in Evisebron's Fons Vitae. Through Evisebron, the inspiration of the Timaeus is present in David of Dinant. This idea of the mediation of the community being replaced by the mediation of the body doesn't really make sense to me, because the mediation of the community is what allows access to the divine, and the processive communities. For the Cathars, the body is what sort of interferes with the relationship with the divine, even because it seems like it's the purification that he talks about in this section is the reduction of the veritable individual, I guess, from the drives and bodily passions. So even if the individual, while it's incarnated, has to live through the body, this mediation is not a mediation that points towards salvation, it seems like.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what he refers to here. So it's at the bottom of 534, top of 535, when he says, there's another mediation consisting in the necessity to pass through the operation of the body in order to act and to feel. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what this mediation consists in. I'm not like very familiar with the doctrine of the Cathars and like what this role of the body was for them. But they were a sort of Gnostic sect, so they held that the human soul was imprisoned in the body and in the world, and had to be purified to sort of escape from this prison. So the body is definitely considered to be something negative that sort of holds the soul down in the world as opposed to allowing it to ascend toward God. So yeah, I guess this mediation. Yeah, I don't really know what exactly this internal mediation is doing. But yeah, there was in the 13th century, there was this massive crusade to eliminate the Cathars, extremely brutal. Like I think tens or hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Yeah, so that's what the Albigensian crusade was.
I think I have this totally unfounded theory that there's a continuity between like the Albigensian crusade and like the resistance against Vichy France in southern France. It's kind of this kind of resistance to northern France from the south seems to recur in like the religious wars as well. It was Protestant in southern France.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that like there are some trying to think of an example, but there are some like studies that have shown like sort of historical remnants of like I don't know about this one in particular, but I think there was something about like if you look at voting records today of individual counties in the U.S., like you can trace back like the difference between the counties that were on the Confederate side versus the ones that were on the Union side in the Civil War, and like in particular states, and you can like sort of see the remnants of the Civil War, 150 or whatever years later. And yeah, so like sometimes these historical events leave remnants that survive for hundreds of years afterwards.
Yeah, I believe that about the Civil War counties.
But yeah, so it's like I think it's this Albigensian crusade. I think is useful to keep in mind when we like looking at some of these different philosophical positions in the medieval period. They sometimes seem kind of academic, right? Like what is the relationship between the divine nature of Christ and the human nature of Christ? Are they one nature or are they two natures, and so on? This might seem sort of academic to us, but for the people at the time, this was literally a life and death question. You could be burned at the stake for taking the wrong position on some of these doctrines. So, yeah, I think this crusade is something that's worth keeping in mind when we're talking about some of these philosophical debates in the medieval period.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and I guess another question that I have reading this is the connection between the Albigensian or the Cathar version of Gnosticism in the 12th, 13th century and like ancient Greek Gnosticism that we saw earlier in reading within the Neoplatonist sections. So there are a whole series. I mean, Gnosticism is a kind of catch-all term for any of these schools of thought or religious traditions that involve some notion of the world as a prison, or the body as a prison, and the soul as being sort of imprisoned in the world. And this idea or this set of ideas sort of reappears in a few different religious contexts. But I don't know if there's a historical continuity between like ancient Greek Gnosticism that Plotinus was arguing against on the one hand, and then the Cathars in the 12th, 13th century. I don't know if it's sort of an independent rediscovery of similar ideas, or if there's an actual historical continuity, or what the connection is.
So I knew nothing about Abelard before I read this section, and I had no idea that he was as interesting as Simondon makes him seem to be, at least. But it seems like the point about this valorization of the individual to the point where you can't have either conversion or procession. As you pointed out earlier, it seems like for conversion there needs to be a kind of openness to the individual, so that there can at least be this relationship of microcosm to macrocosm, or this analogical relation. And then also, because the individual is valorized, the rules of the community or the relation to the community is degraded, or seen as having no authority, or no trace of respect for the community's authority remains. But yeah, I don't know. Is that your understanding of this? How the I guess the absolute nature of the individual in Abelard's thought makes both procession and conversion impossible?
Yeah, I also don't know a lot about Abelard. I only know of like the whole episode with Héloïse and Abelard. But yeah, I think any type of doctrine, like we saw earlier with Roscellinus, any doctrine that holds that the individual is something sort of self-contained and independent in this way will make it very difficult to understand what the relationship between the community and the individual and the community could be. And you know, in a Christian context, the relationship between the individual and God. And I think what Simondon suggests in the section on the Cathars here, he argues that these two forms of participation, the conversion and procession, they each sort of capture one side of the individual, or they emphasize one side of the individual and then sort of eliminate the other side, or they each grasp a certain aspect of the individual and leave the rest of it out. And I think this is a sort of characteristic move in Simondon's thought of like taking these two opposed positions and trying to grasp their unity, the point of unity that they both arise out of. And so he wants to arrive at an understanding of the individual that allows for both procession and conversion to be understood as sort of components of that conception of the individual. And so he necessarily has to have an understanding of the individual that is not self-contained or self-enclosed in the way that Roscellinus or Abelard's conception of the individual is. Okay, I think maybe this is a good place to stop for today, unless there are any other questions or comments before we close.
It makes Abelard sound like he's like skateboarding on the monastery steps or something. No trace of respect for the community.
Yeah, it's I mean, I know that there was a lot of controversy in the medieval period about the rules of the monastic order, and like even something like or the rules for the church in general, like the we all know now that priests in the Catholic Church are not allowed to marry, but that was a relatively late introduction. I think it was like 11th or 12th century, and it was primarily, it wasn't anything to do with like, you know, priests being pure or anything like that. It was because they wanted to make sure that priests would not inherit their titles, or that the children of priests would not inherit positions in the church, and so the church hierarchy would still maintain the power to appoint the priests and bishops and so on, as opposed to having them be inherited titles. And so there was all kinds of conflict over like the rules of different monastic orders, and you know, whether priests could marry and so on, all throughout the medieval period. And yeah, so Abelard takes like a radical line and argues that monks should be able to marry, and yeah, he's definitely outside the mainstream of the Catholic tradition on those rules of the monastic orders.
That's interesting. Sort of a alliance versus filiation issue.
Yeah, it's a lot of the sort of traditions of the Catholic Church that are maintained today are sort of medieval. Were introduced for like specific reasons in medieval period, and then have just become sort of like part of the tradition of the church, as opposed to, you know, being something that was like sort of deliberately instituted or instituted for specifically religious reasons. It was often like a sort of organizational or something like that, like an organizational question that ended up becoming part of the tradition of the church.
Maybe people will be talking about the rules of GGQC reading groups someday in the same way.
Yeah, we'll have archaeologists or whatever hundreds of years from now, like examining the chat logs from our discussions.
Yeah, for some reason, they stopped using Alastair entirely in 2022.
Yeah. So I think on that note, we can probably end here for today. So thanks everyone for coming out, and I think hopefully I should have time to prepare more for next time, and we can have a full session next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone.
I'll try to make it next time again.
Yeah, bye.